Well, hey, everybody, this is Mr. Perry, and today we're talking about Shakespeare's Macbeth and going over some background knowledge y'all need to know. And at this point, you should have the note sheet with you that was provided in class. And the first thing you're going to want to do is to make sure that you've gone to the class website, which is Mr. Perry, ELA11.weebly.com. Click on the Shakespeare's Macbeth link and label that map according to the information at the top of the page. All right, and then from there we're going to get into things we need to know about Shakespeare. So here we go. Number one, we're going to start with just a brief timeline of Shakespeare's life, and this is not in the notes, so I'll just keep this quick. When Shakespeare started his career, England was ruled by Queen Elizabeth, and so this was known as Elizabethan England. And then basically the golden age of drama began around 1558. This was again when Shakespeare and a bunch of other people were writing plays, and everybody was going to see them. And then midway through Shakespeare's career, Queen Elizabeth dies, and then King James I takes over. And you should know that he was formerly King James VI of Scotland. So they basically took this guy from Scotland who was king and said, hey, come on down, we want to make you king of England. And then the golden age of drama ended in around 1625, which was the closing of the theaters. And Shakespeare, again, was a big part of the whole golden age of drama in general, wrote a lot of the great plays that we know from this era. So now we're going to get to our notes, and we're going to chat a bit about Shakespeare's life and why he is regarded as the greatest writer of English literature ever. All right. So the first thing to know about him is he was just very influential to society and literature. He was profoundly influential to society and literature. One of the ways that we judge, how great of a writer somebody is, looking at what they contributed to society, what they contributed to literature. And there's hardly a story that has been written since Shakespeare that isn't, at least in some ways, influenced by his work. So like I say, just the overall influence that he had on society as well as future writers is incredibly profound. He is a timeless writer. His plays are still performed all around the world and taught in high schools even 400 years after his death. And there just really aren't many writers who fit this category. Most people are popular for a little while and then they die out. But something about Shakespeare's plays and something about his stories and his words just have this lasting aspect to them. They just don't go away, and people, even in the digital age, people still go back and find new things to talk about and new things to discover in his plays. Another great thing about Shakespeare is he wrote in a very powerful poetic form. It's really one of the greatest things that Shakespeare is known for, is just the power of his poetry. He was able to string words together in such a way that few people have ever been able to match. And his metaphors, his similes, the way he personifies things, the way he has his characters describe things, just really get into this deep level of profound poetic insight into the human condition. And like I say, just this powerful poetic form. And then finally, one of the greatest things about Shakespeare is that he changed English for the better. He actually improved the language. He added an estimate of 1,700 words and phrases. He invented phrases, he invented words, he contributed to the language really more than any other writer in history, which is probably one of the biggest reasons why he holds this title of greatest writer. All right, let's keep going. A little bit more about Shakespeare's life. For somebody who's had such an influence on our culture, we don't really know much about him. Really, all we know for sure is that he was born in a place called Stratford-upon-Avon, which is in England. In 1564, we know that he lived there and he produced a family. We know eventually he moved to London and became an actor and a writer. And then we also know later in life, he returned to Stratford, he made a will, and then he died in 1614. These really are the only facts that we know about Shakespeare's life. Now, what we don't know for sure, which is kind of interesting, we really don't know how many plays he wrote and in what order he wrote them. We can kind of guess at, the order in which he wrote them based on how they progress and how they get better. But to be honest, we don't know for sure. We don't really know how to spell his name. Shakespeare wrote his name several different ways in his lifetime, and it appears in several different ways in his documents. So again, there's really no correct way to spell his name. Speaking of which, we don't even really know how to pronounce his name. We call it, the generally accepted pronunciation is Shakespeare, but there's evidence that it could have been Shakespeare, it could have been Shakespeare. There's a lot of different ways that he might have pronounced his own name. We actually don't even really know what he looked like. All portraits that were made about Shakespeare were made long after his death, like decades after his death. So, again, they were made from memory. And so there you go. Again, there's a lot of speculation even about what he even looked like. And we don't even really know whether he left England. There's a lot of evidence to suggest that he traveled, but we honestly just really don't know. What we do know, and again, this is based on documentation, is that he was baptized on April 25th, 1564, which means he was probably born on April 23rd, but again, we don't know that for sure. He died on April 23rd, 1614 in Stratford. We know that he went to grammar school. We know he started his career as an actor. We know he married a woman named Anne Hathaway, who was a few years older than him. We also know that he had 3 children, Susanna, Hamnet, and Judith. Let's see, what else do we know about Shakespeare? He was part owner and playwright for Lord Chamberlain's Men during Elizabethan England. It was Lord Chamberlain's Men. When King James took over, it switched to the King's Men. King James had really loved Shakespeare and really had an attraction to the theater, and went as far as claiming Shakespeare's acting troupe and calling them the King's Men. We know that Shakespeare helped build the Globe Theater. We also know that he wrote around 38 plays, and then he wrote over 150 sonnets and other poems. Let's take it back to the notes now. King James. There's a lot of reasons why King James had an influence on this play. Number one, King James was King of England when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, and essentially Shakespeare wrote this play as a gift to King James. There's a lot of things about Macbeth that appeal specifically to King James, which I'm going to cover on the next slide. You already know that this is the only play that takes place in Scotland, and surprise, King James was originally King James VI of Scotland, so it's about his home country. James I, just so you know, he was the one who sponsored the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia. He was known to persecute people for religious reasons. He's actually the one responsible for the King James Bible, and he caused the migration of the Puritans to America. So King James was known for being this really strict, very kind of harsh religious ruler. Now, the aspects of the play that were written specifically for King James. First off, the play is loosely based on historical events which included the Stuart family tree, and King James himself was a Stuart. So really, Macbeth is about King James's ancestors. So there you go. Also, it's one of Shakespeare's shortest plays. Apparently, James did not like a lot of Shakespeare's long plays, so we've got that going for us. King James was also obsessed with witchcraft. He wrote a book called Demonology, which was all about witches and how to detect them. So the fact that the opening scene in our play is 3 witches planning to, screw with somebody later on in the day, this obviously would have caught King James's attention, and clearly Shakespeare is using Macbeth to kind of play to King James's interests and his passions, if you will. All right, what else do we want to know about Macbeth? So Macbeth, the play, is known as one of Shakespeare's, quote, great tragedies. It's one of the great tragedies written towards the end of his career, written around 1605 or 1606. And it is a tragedy, so just like with Oedipus, we have the rise and the fall of a tragic hero. And the tragic hero is somebody who, he's successful, but he always contains some kind of tragic flaw. Next. Okay, talking about acts and scenes. So all Shakespearean plays, so this is, again, going back to your notes, all Shakespearean plays are broken up into 5 acts and scenes, all right? Acts are usually indicated with an uppercase Roman numeral, and then scenes are indicated with lowercase Roman numerals. So in Act 1 and Act 2, you're going to see the rise of the tragic hero. In Act 3, you have the turning point, so things are going to start to go badly. And then in Acts 4 and 5, you have the fall of the tragic hero, and usually in Act 5, at the end, it results in death or some kind of serious tragedy. So there you go, acts and scenes, and then here's the general 5-act structure that you see. Let's see, what's kind of interesting about our play, this is not in your notes, but this is kind of interesting. Macbeth is known as a cursed play. It's considered bad luck to say the name Macbeth on stage unless you're actually performing the play. So you'll hear actors referring to this as, quote, the Scottish play. They won't actually say the name Macbeth because, again, superstition has it that if you say the name Macbeth while you're on stage, something bad is going to happen. You're somehow bringing, bad luck to the performance. So again, a little bit of an interesting side note. We're going to continue with our notes here. When you read any Shakespearean play, you need to know a couple of things. Number one, soliloquy. All right, now this is a speech delivered by a character who is alone on stage. And the whole point of this is to reveal the character's thoughts to the audience. So Shakespeare would have somebody walk out on stage, they're all alone, and he would have them deliver a soliloquy. And again, it's just this long speech where the character is describing what he or she is thinking at the time. Because again, Shakespeare wants to reveal those thoughts to the audience. You also have what's called an aside, and this is a speech intended for the audience where the character's not alone on stage. So it's kind of like a soliloquy. The actor might walk to the front of the stage and kind of mutter something under his breath, or his or her breath, but they always had to say it loud enough for the audience to hear. But it's just understood that if you're in the audience and you see a character deliver something as an aside, you just know that the other characters who are up there didn't hear it, all right? So soliloquies and asides, both really important because typically it's Shakespeare revealing something important about the character to the audience. What else do we need to know here? We need to know figurative language, all right? Lots of poetic language in Shakespeare's plays. So we're going to do some separate assignments on this one, but we're going to talk about poetry and figurative language, using metaphor, simile, and personification to describe things. Lots of poetic, what we call sound devices, lots of alliteration and assonance and things of that nature. So we'll get into that later. All right. The dialogue was really important in Shakespeare's plays because the dialogue actually includes the setting. The characters will describe what they're seeing and where they are. And the dialogue often includes stage directions for the other actors as well. All right, the majority of the dialogue is written in poetic form, what's called iambic pentameter and rhymed couplets. So that's some additional notes here really quick. Iambic pentameter goes like this. It is one line of poetry, one line of dialogue with what's called 5 metrical feet, each consisting of one short or unstressed syllable followed by one long or stressed syllable. So there's 10 syllables all total. Here's an example of iambic pentameter. You got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. So 10 syllables. But you have an unstressed followed by a stressed. So I'll fight till from my bones, my flesh be hacked. That's the way you would deliver this line. This is somebody talking about the fact that they're gonna fight until they die, basically. But they say it in this poetic form called iambic pentameter. So each pairing is called an iamb, and there's 5 of them, all right, giving us 10 syllables all total. So it's, I'll fight till from my bones my flesh be hacked is how you would say that. And you hear the unstressed followed by the stressed syllable. We also get what's called a rhymed couplet. Lots of scenes will end with what's called a rhymed couplet. And it's 2 lines of the same length that rhyme and complete one thought. Okay, so here's another example of iambic pentameter, but this is a rhymed couplet. Away, and mock with time the fairest show, false face must hide what the false heart doth know. All right, so this is again a rhymed couplet. You'll see a lot of those in the play, typically at the end of a scene. Moving forward, what do we have next? Types of characters. All right, so you've got the tragic hero, already covered in a previous slide. Somebody of high status who contains a tragic flaw, yada, yada, yada. There's what's called a foil. Shakespeare very often includes what are called literary foils. So a foil is a character whose personality strongly contrasts another character. So you might take a character who's like a good person, and then you're going to create another character who's a totally corrupt person. And when you have these characters side by side on stage, they are foils for one another because you're kind of seeing one extreme to the other. You also have what's called a comedic relief. Shakespeare really liked to break up his tragedies with comedy. So every once in a while you'll have a character get up on stage and the only purpose of this character is to make jokes and to make the audience laugh. And it breaks up the tension of the tragedy. So unfortunately, Macbeth only has one scene of comedic relief, but to be honest, it's one of my all-time favorites. We're going to have a lot of fun with this one when we get there. All right, major themes in Macbeth. We've got 4 of them. All right, so the first one is ambition, greed, and corruption. All right, and unfortunately, this is a theme that's still very much with society today. We see lots of political leaders who are ambitious. They want to achieve high status, but very often that ambition leads to greed and then finally corruption. They lose sense of what's right and wrong. And so there you go. We're going to see that developed a bit in the play. This one, the ambiguity of evil. So basically what this means is sometimes in life, the people who are the most evil pretend to be our best friends. Or when we first meet them, the people who are most evil appear to be very friendly. All right, so that's what ambiguity is. Ambiguity is kind of when somebody's sort of difficult to figure out, when something's kind of tough to interpret. You say it's kind of ambiguous. So again, sometimes our worst enemies pretend to be our best friends, and that, again, is this whole idea of the ambiguity of evil. A major theme in the play is the disruption of nature, or the reversal of nature. So in this play, we enter this weird, nightmarish realm where all of the normal rules of nature are turned upside down. So, you know, mice chase cats, and cats chase dogs, for instance, or men behave like women and women behave like men. There's, again, a lot of what people would consider the quote-unquote natural order in this play is very much disrupted and reversed. So there's a lot of that developed throughout. And then finally, guilt and judgment. This idea that when we do bad things in life and we live with guilt, very often we're worried about judgment. We're worried about how other people are going to judge us, or we might be worried about judgment in the afterlife if that's something that we are worried about. All right. And then from here, I'm just going to take you through some other just points of interest. A lot of people typically chat about when we look at Shakespeare. In London, the theaters were located outside the city walls. And when they weren't being used for plays, they were sometimes used for what's called bear baiting and like dog fighting and things like that. They had these really violent, really horrifying methods of entertainment back then. So the theaters were known for being these kind of slummy things. They didn't have a lot of status, even though people loved them and they, you know, went to the plays left and right. The whole culture of drama and the culture of the theaters was kind of looked down upon. So even the actors and the playwrights were not really well regarded by society, even though the plays were really popular. There was very much this kind of love-hate relationship with society and the theaters. They didn't have a lot of sets or props to work with, so the actors, again, had to rely on the words of the play and their voice to provide the setting and to kind of get the audience to imagine what's going on. Because they didn't have electricity, the plays always took place in the afternoon, and that's why the theaters didn't have roofs, because you had to let in the sunlight in order to, or roofs, not roofs, you had to let in the sunlight in order to provide, you know, lighting so people could see. The costumes were very elaborate, and sometimes there were special effects used, and of course women weren't allowed to act during this time, so the female roles had to be played by men or young boys. A couple of images here. This is the Globe Theater. This is an etching of what the Globe Theater looked like back in the 1600s in London. Had this kind of octagonal shape. Now, if you were to visit the Globe today, they rebuilt it, they moved it and rebuilt it, so this kind of gives you more of an aerial shot. You can see the open air theater here, all right? And then the next shot is, that was not supposed to happen. The next shot is pretty cool. This is what it looks like on the inside. Kind of gives you an idea, if you were to visit the globe, what it would look like. So if royalty and people who were wealthy usually sat up here in the seats, these folks down here were were called groundlings. These were kind of the poor people who would pay a penny just to walk in, but you had to stand the whole time. Now obviously you could get a lot closer and you could see the action, but the people back here got to sit down and be comfortable. And of course the plays lasted sometimes 3, sometimes 4 hours. So yeah, if you're sitting there standing up, it's gonna hurt. The stage is right here. Obviously, here's where a lot of the action would take place. Here's the balcony that would also represent like a castle. And what's cool is this area up here, which you can hardly see, but this is called the heavens, and you can see it's got like paintings on them, like the moon and stars. Actors could actually get up here and crawl out on top of this, like inside this area, and they could like bang on the panels to create like thunder. They could make animal sounds if you're supposed to be like in a jungle or something. Here's where some of the special effects would take place. So that gives you an idea of what the theater looked like on the inside. All right, finally, some advice on how to read Shakespeare. So one of the biggest mistakes that a lot of people make when they read Shakespeare out loud is they read it line by line, all right? And what you're gonna wanna do is read to the punctuation marks, all right? When you get to a comma, you wanna make a short pause and then make a longer pause when you get to periods, colons, semicolons, a dash, or a question mark, all right? Again, the goal is to read sentence by sentence, not line by line. If you read line by line, it really just sounds weird, all right? So that's something to keep in mind. You're going to get what are called inverted sentences, where the word order is out of order, and sometimes Shakespeare will skip words altogether, which is called an ellipses. So you know, just know that you're going to run into that. You just kind of have to deal with it. The most important thing is to really make sure you understand soliloquies and asides, where characters are revealing things about what they're thinking. A lot of test questions and a lot of essay assignments deal with soliloquies or asides, or when characters are revealing secrets. And then finally, when you read Shakespeare, the best thing to do is to try to appreciate the poetry, because really that's what he's known for. In a Shakespearean play, there ought to be certain lines and certain words that he uses to describe things that really kind of hit home. And again, it's that beautiful poetry, the powerful poetic voice that he used that really kind of solidified him as one of the greats. All right, so there you go, guys, your introduction to Shakespeare, and we will start reading in class shortly. Thank you.